Early Christian writers weren't exactly looking to pagan philosophers for advice on theology. In fact, they were more focused on debunking the traditional Greco-Roman religions. But Hermes Trismegistus stands out as a rare exception, a mythological philosopher viewed by many as the ultimate sage, and viewed by some Christians as a non-Christian philosopher who somehow stumbled upon true Christian theology centuries before the arrival of Christ. A 4th century Christian author named Lactantius argued that Hermes recognized the oneness of God, affirmed the notion that humans were made in the image of God, and even believed that God had a son. Lactantius wrote that Hermes said everything about God the Father and much about the Son, which is contained in the divine secrets. So what did Hermes Trismegistus teach that he even impressed otherwise harsh critics of Greco-Roman religion? Today we're examining Hermeticism, or what scholars now call Hermetism, an esoteric religious and philosophical system that wove together Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Greco-Roman mystery religions, Judaism, alchemy, and astrology. Hermetic philosophy went on to influence scholars in the Islamic world, and Hermetic texts were eventually rediscovered by Europeans during the Renaissance and were translated into Latin, making them available to new generations of European scientists, philosophers, and theologians. Much of modern Western esotericism is indebted to the ideas preserved in these ancient texts. Now, scholars use the term Hermeticism to refer to this later reception and reinterpretation of Hermetic texts from the Renaissance onward, and they use the term Hermetism to refer to the ancient tradition, and today we'll be focusing on the latter. So what is Hermetism, and what are its core concepts and principles? Most of what we know about Hermetism comes from a gigantic body of ancient texts known as the Hermetica. These are texts attributed to the aforementioned Hermes Trismegistus, which means Hermes the thrice greatest. That's like really, really, really great. Hermes Trismegistus was not a historical person, but a mythological combo of the Egyptian god Thoth and his Greek equivalent Hermes. Thoth was the god of scribes, wisdom, astronomy, and magic. He was associated with the ibis and the baboon and is frequently depicted as an ibis-headed man in Egyptian art. In Greek religion, Hermes was the emissary of the gods, and one who could guide souls in the afterlife. As far back as the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, the Egyptian god Thoth was identified with the Greek Hermes. And during the Hellenistic period, some intellectuals believed that the gods had originally been humans who lived in ancient times, and Hermes Trismegistus received the same treatment. In many Hermetic texts, he appears as a human, and by the 1st century CE, Hermes Trismegistus was recognized as the quintessential philosopher, magician, and divine sage of the distant past. In reality, all of the texts of the Hermetica are pseudonymous. The scholar Christian Bull theorizes they were composed by Hellenized Egyptian priests. The Roman geographer Strabo, for example, mentions Egyptian priests living in Thebes, educated in philosophy and astronomy, who attribute to Hermes all wisdom of this particular kind. But whoever wrote these texts, they really knew their philosophy. Hermetic texts show influence especially from Middle Platonism, but also from Stoicism and Neo-Pythagorean thought, as well as Jewish thought in some cases. The oldest texts in the Hermetica may date as far back as the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, though some of the more famous philosophical texts date from the 1st to 3rd century CE. And there were a lot of Hermetic texts. Ancient people threw around what were probably wild exaggerations. The philosopher Iamblichus, for example, shares a report that there were 20,000 books attributed to Hermes. The Egyptian priest Manetho claims over 36,000. Exaggeration or not, there were many, many texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus or one of his disciples, and most of them are lost to us. So our picture of Hermetism is incomplete, and these books cover a huge array of topics. Now, scholars of the years have categorized the Hermetica into technical texts and religio-philosophical texts. The technical books cover topics like astrology, the power of gemstones and plants, alchemy, and magic. The philosophical ones discuss the structure and origins of the cosmos, the nature of human beings, the properties of God, and how to ascend after death. As with many scholarly categories, though, these are modern labels that wouldn't have made sense to the ancient people writing and reading these texts. You can find ritual techniques in the philosophical books, and you can find philosophy in the technical books, so don't think of these as stark, hard and fast categories. One characteristic that the Hermetic philosophical books do share is that they're not presented in a way that a modern reader might expect.
So, what's so different about them?
Oh, hi. Well, they're usually written as interactive dialogues between two characters, usually Hermes Trismegistus and one of his disciples, like Isis, Asclepius, or his son Tot.
Oh, so like a Socratic dialogue.
Well, not exactly. Both Socratic dialogues and Hermetic dialogues use the conversational format, but the tone and aim between the two genres is very different. So in Socratic dialogues, the tone is investigative and critical. Sometimes it's even lighthearted, with Socrates engaging in back and forth exchanges with his companions to get them to uncover contradictions and to push them toward deeper understanding of a particular concept. While in Hermetic dialogues, the tone is much more didactic and mystical. Hermes Trismegistus is just imparting divine wisdom to a passive student who's just asking questions without much pushback. Got it?
I'm gonna need a citation for that.
Okay, fine. Sources in the description below, as usual. The most famous philosophical texts are found in a compilation called the Corpus Hermeticum. 17 treatises that were compiled into one text centuries later, sometime during the Byzantine period. So while these are among the most well-known Hermetic texts, they should not be considered a Hermetic canon of authoritative texts, like what the New Testament is for Christianity. Other compilations include some texts found among the Nag Hammadi codices, and there's also 40 excerpts in an anthology by the 5th century author Ioannis Stobaeus. With so many texts, and many of them fragmentary, it's impossible to identify a consistent, systematic Hermetic theology, but we can identify some key themes shared across these texts. And a good place to begin is the Hermetic understanding of cosmogony, the origins of the cosmos. This is primarily laid out in a text called Poimandres. This is a dialogue between a being named Poimandres and Hermes Trismegistus. Poimandres is the teacher in this case and seems to be a reference to God himself. According to this text, the essence of God is mind, or nous. Creation begins with God, or I guess I should say, the first mind, speaking into existence his son, the Logos, together with the second mind, aka the craftsman or demiurge. The Logos descends into nature to become the 4 elements, while the demiurge creates 7 heavenly rulers, the 7 classical planets, the Moon, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These in turn set creation in motion, producing animals and other living things from the elements. This cosmogony is largely inspired by Platonic philosophy. In Plato's Timaeus, Plato shares an elaborate cosmic model that formed the basis for how philosophers understood cosmogony for the next few centuries. Plato described the cosmos as a great sphere, with Earth at its center. The stars and the 7 classical planets revolve around the Earth in their own concentric spheres. The planets were regarded as deities, and the cosmos itself was filled with souls and other intermediary spirits. Everything was composed of 4 primal elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and the world was created not by the supreme God who existed beyond the cosmos, but by a second divine being called the craftsman or demiurge. Furthermore, the creation of the world required the uniting of 2 opposing forces: necessity or ananke, which brings about activity and disorder, and intellect or nous, which subjugates necessity to order and reason. Most Greco-Roman philosophical systems, including Middle Platonism, Stoicism, Gnostic Christianity, and Hermetism, were based on this framework, but each had its own spin on it. Hermetic texts like the Poimandres share a very lofty, transcendent view of God, whom they called the Father. As the scholar David Litwa puts it, the Hermetic God is a supreme, ineffable being who transcends language, bodies, and all perceptible reality. In a writing called Hermes to Asclepius, Hermes tells his pupil, God is not mind, but he is the cause of mind's being. He is not spirit, but the cause of spirit's being. And he is not light, but the cause of light's being. Now, we don't always find agreement in the exact specifics of the Hermetic view of God, but it's clear that the Hermetic God is one, is supreme, and is utterly transcendent. Poimandres also describes a demiurge or craftsman, which might sound familiar if you've seen my videos on Gnosticism or Valentinian Christianity. Several ancient groups around this time believed in a lower creator god who crafted the material world. But while the demiurge in these other traditions is either ignorant or even malicious, the demiurge in Hermetism is closer to Plato's idea of the craftsman. He's not necessarily a bad guy, he's just second to the ultimate god, in this case a second nous or mind. Hermetism also shares a very lofty view of humanity. In Poimandres, the supreme god creates a primordial androgynous human. The text says, Nous, the father of all, who is life and light, gave birth to a man like himself, whom he loved as his own child. This human is described as having the image of God, and here we see some influence from the book of Genesis. This androgynous, primordial human is allowed to join in the demiurge's work, creating the material world, what the text calls nature. When this human sees their own reflection in water, the human desires to inhabit nature, causing the primal human and nature to embrace. And the text implies sexually, because this embrace produces a being that is uniquely comprised of a mortal body and an immortal soul. Poimandres says, for this reason, of all living beings on earth, man alone is twofold, mortal because of the body, immortal because of the real man. Real man in the sense of an essential human, our true self. Later, all living things, including the human, are split into male and female so they can multiply. However, humans retain this dual nature, an immortal essence that is divine, and a mortal body that is tied to the world and controlled by fate. Capital F, fate. In Hermetism, fate could be described as a cosmic force or external energy that governs the world and imposes action on it, and it was closely related to the movement of the stars and planets. One Hermetic text says, the stars serve fate. One can neither escape fate nor protect oneself from the powerful influence of the stars. The stars are the instrument of fate. By fate's decree, all things reach their intended end in nature and among human beings. Fate was also administered by the decans, the Egyptian zodiac. These were 36 constellations that were important for tracking the calendar, and they had astrological significance as well. They were conceptualized as Egyptian astral deities who controlled 10 days each for a total of 360 days. Hermetists believed that the decans, together with the 7 planets, could cause major events like famines, droughts, and earthquakes. But fate really only controls our bodies and the world of matter, not our true essential self. The divine part of humanity can break free from fate. Another Hermetic text reads, we have the power to choose. To choose the better is up to us. Choosing when dictated by vices draws near to bodily nature. Since all intelligent reason in us has free choice, fate does not control it. So this dual divine material nature means that the mundane world can distract us or turn us away from the correct path, and some Hermetic texts describe this human condition somewhat pessimistically. Poimandres reads, he who loves the body which is born from the error of desire remains wandering in the dark and sensibly suffers the effects of death. But other texts describe it more optimistically. Humanity's dual material and divine nature means that humans occupy an honored middle position between the gods and material things. The Hermetic text called Asclepius reads, wondering at heavenly beings and worshipping them, tending earthly beings and governing them. So humanity stands between the earthly and divine. But regardless of how the human condition is framed, Hermetic texts share a deep concern with ascending and reuniting with the supreme God. In a dramatic scene in Poimandres, the soul after death ascends through the 7 heavens and merges with the first mind. This is the final good for those who have received knowledge, to be made God. With the mortal body left behind, one must ascend to the highest realms, the 8th and 9th spheres. Why the 8th and 9th? Well, remember that the 7 planetary spheres govern the material world through fate, so you need to ascend above them in order to be beyond the influence of fate, where your essential human can reunite with the divine. These realms are called the Ogdoad and Ennead respectively. The Ogdoad means the eightfold. In its original meaning, it refers to the 8 primordial deities of Egyptian religion. In the Hermetic system, though, these become the 8 powers that make up the realm of the Demiurge. This realm is the 8th sphere of the cosmos, located just beyond the 7 planets. The Ennead, on the other hand, means the ninefold, and it's an even higher realm of existence. In Egyptian mythology, it referred to the 9 great deities worshipped at Heliopolis: Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. In Hermetic cosmology, the Ennead becomes the 9th sphere of the cosmos, where the self-begotten Nous dwells, and it's the destination of the most righteous souls after death. So how do you ascend up into the 8th and 9th? Well, various texts provide instructions on how to achieve this ascension. Scholars call these instructions the Way of Hermes, though as we'll discuss in the next section, we should be careful about framing this Way of Hermes as a distinct religious community. A lot of Hermetic texts could be classified as initiatory, but it's not really an initiation into a distinct cult, like the cult of Isis or the cult of Mithras. Hermetism probably wasn't that well organized. We can call them initiatory in the sense that these texts serve the purpose of guiding a reader or a disciple through a transformative mystical journey of deeper and deeper knowledge. This path to deathlessness or salvation is not for everyone, but only for an elect few. In fact, some Hermetic texts describe something like the belief in the transmigration of the soul, as in after death, one's soul is usually reborn into another body. The souls of the just are reborn as kings, philosophers, and esteemed intellectuals. The souls of the wicked, though, are reborn in the bodies of animals. One text reads, "Yet if you are workers of greater sins, you will not advance from the molded body when your due service is paid. You will not dwell in heaven, nor even in human bodies. You will complete the rest of your lives wandering the bodies of non-reasoning beasts. Only the most righteous will ascend after death, which might take many lifetimes." Another text reads, "Do you see how many bodies we must pass through, my son? How many troops of demons, cosmic connections, and stellar circuits in order to hasten toward the one and only?" But for the initiates who are worthy and righteous enough to attain it, this means breaking free from fate, learning the secrets needed to pass beyond the planetary spheres. The starting point appears to be gnosis, or knowledge, particularly knowledge of the self. People need to obtain true, intimate knowledge of their true divine nature. We saw this in that quote from Poimandres, which describes merging with the Supreme God after death, the final good for those who have received knowledge. The initiate must be taught that they are an immortal being with the potential to ascend through the heavenly spheres and reunite with their true source. In Book 4 of the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes tells his son, "Knowledge is not a beginning of the good, but it furnishes us with the beginning of the good that will be known. So let us seize this beginning and travel with all speed, for the path is very crooked that leaves familiar things of the present to return to primordial things of old." Now, in Poimandres, this ascent and merging with God is something that happens to you after you die, but other writings interpreted this as an ecstatic experience which could happen to every Hermetist in this life. Dr. David Litwa describes it as a rebirth into higher divine consciousness. And several Hermetic texts seem to describe rituals where an initiate could experience a rebirth and activate their higher consciousness. One of the best examples is Book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum, where Hermes' son Tot undergoes a ritual of rebirth. The text begins with Tot asking Hermes to teach him the way. "I am ready now, and my mind is set firmly away from the beguilement of the world. Fulfill your promise to me in which you said you would set before me, the way in which rebirth is bestowed." Hermes responds by explaining that rebirth requires that Tot cleanse himself of the irrational torments of matter. These torments of matter are a list of vices or sins, like injustice, lust, greed, and envy, but chief among them is ignorance. Next, Tot must observe a period of ritual silence, before Hermes announces that Tot is being purified by God and is being filled with divine power, most notably, knowledge. After all, you need knowledge to get rid of that ignorance. "Henceforth, my child, rejoice. The powers of God purify you anew. To us has come knowledge of God, and when it comes, my child, ignorance has been expelled." So now that Tot has been filled with these divine powers, Hermes then teaches Tot how to perform the Hymn of Rebirth, an earthly version of a cosmic song. And the text actually goes into a lot of detail about how to perform it. "And so, my son, standing in an open space and facing south at the descent of the setting sun, kneel down in prayer, and likewise face east at sunrise." And here's why I said you can sometimes find ritual techniques in the philosophical books. The text has specific instructions on how to perform this hymn. The scholar Christian Bull thinks that the hymn that follows was actually performed by Hermetic groups and may have been drawn from a Hermetic hymnal. It's even titled Secret Hymn Book, Song Number 4. So maybe it was part of a collection. The hymn itself praises God as the source of all existence and order in the cosmos. "Together let us praise him, raised high above the heavens, creator of all nature." Now, the hymn lyrics don't actually look like a typical ancient Greek religious hymn. In fact, a lot of the language looks more like what we see in Greek magical papyri from Egypt. So some scholars think it was translated from an Egyptian original. Overall, Corpus Hermeticum 13 describes a mystical experience that transforms the initiate. He no longer identifies with his material body, but has merged with the nous. It's called a rebirth because he essentially is a new human. Scholars describe it almost like an exorcism. You exorcise all of that ignorance, deceit, and envy, and replace it with knowledge, truth, and joy. And being filled with these divine powers, the person essentially is now composed of a new immaterial and immortal body, a body impervious to the vicissitudes of fate. It also means that when this initiate dies, their essential self will automatically be released and returned to its place of origin. Another text describing an initiate glimpsing the 8th and 9th realms is called the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which was discovered among the Nag Hammadi codices. The text begins with Tot reminding Hermes of his promise to induct him into the Ogdoad and Ennead. "My father, yesterday you promised me that you would bring my mind to the 8th and afterwards you would bring me into the 9th. Hermes agrees and they start singing a hymn of ascent. At its climax, the initiate sees the 8th sphere. "I see the Ogdoad and the souls that are in it, and the angels singing hymns to the Ennead and its power. And I see him who has all their power and who creates by means of the spirit." In other words, the initiate glimpses what he will see when his body dissolves and his soul ascends after death. From these two texts, we see that Hermetists were deeply concerned with a transformative process of rebirth and the soul rejoining God after death, but both emphasize that you can experience an ecstatic union with the divine even while alive, which you could achieve through personal purification and proper ritual. Now, the fact that these two texts describe specific hymns raises the question, what did Hermetic practice look like? Scholars have long debated if there were Hermetic religious communities. Like, were there people walking around calling themselves Hermetists, attending Hermetic churches, and performing this ritual of rebirth? To answer this question, it's helpful to consider what we mean by religious community. One might think of a community similar to a Christian church. In late antique Egypt, Christian was a social identity. Christian communities would meet at recognizable buildings called basilicas, led by recognizable religious authorities called priests or monks. They shared a sacred story about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and they shared communal rituals like baptism or the Eucharist. This kind of structure provides a clear sense of identity and belonging to its adherents, and a clear set of characteristics that help us identify a specific religion that we call Christianity. On the other hand, we can imagine a looser, less definable group, maybe something like a reading circle or a philosophical society, groups where individuals are drawn together by a shared interest in certain texts and ideas, but without formalized doctrines or authoritative leadership. Scholars in recent years have argued there must have been some sort of Hermetic communities, though it's difficult to envision what they really looked like on the ground. Scattered throughout Hermetic texts are references to communal rituals, like a ritual embrace and formal prayers. A great example is found from another text from the Nag Hammadi codices, the so-called Prayer of Thanksgiving, which appears to be some sort of Hermetic liturgical prayer, possibly chanted as part of a Hermetic gathering. The prayer starts with an introductory line. This is the prayer that they spoke, perhaps alluding to an actual social group, before it launches into a prayer of thanks for the supreme God. We give thanks to you. Every soul and heart is lifted up to you, honored with the name God and praised with the name Father. Hermetic ideas permeate the prayer, like the idea that humans possess a spark of the divine, and that there's a connection between the divine mind and the human mind, enabling them to comprehend higher truth. We rejoice having been illuminated by your knowledge. We rejoice because while we were in the body, you have made us divine through your knowledge. Again, notice that focus on Gnosis. The prayer ends with a side note that again seems to imply a ritual gathering of some sort. When they had said these things in the prayer, they embraced each other and they went to eat their holy food, which has no blood in it. This seems to be a reference to a vegetarian sacramental meal, which is also mentioned in another Hermetic text called Asclepius. Wishing these things, we turn to a pure meal without flesh of animals. Now, it might be a stretch to say that this prayer was performed in a liturgical setting, like a Hermetic church, though maybe we can envision something like a Masonic lodge, a fraternity, or a philosophical school. We just don't know. David Litwa envisions something like a philosophical discussion group, a loose group of individuals seeking salvation through initiatory readings. Christian Bull argues that wherever and however these rituals were performed, these gatherings likely involved Egyptian priesthoods and groups connected somehow to Egyptian temples and Roman Egypt. He speculates we can envision an Egyptian priest setting up a reading group in the marketplace or public forum, or maybe in the private house of a wealthy individual. Ancient texts also mention Egyptian priests living in temple complexes, like they actually lived there, like on a campus, and groups would gather for banquets or other gatherings in a room or building on the premises. Dr. Bull proposes that Hermetism might have originated in groups devoted to various Egyptian gods around the turn of the Common Era. As the educated elite of the Roman Empire traveled to Egypt, seeking the ancient wisdom that Egypt was famous for, Egyptian religion became commercialized, so to speak. Priestly associations dedicated to Thoth Hermes sprang up in cities like Hermopolis and Thebes, where pilgrims could be instructed by actual Egyptian priests. And these Egyptian priests adopted the language and vocabulary of Greco-Roman philosophy, combining Egyptian and Greek elements in a way that would have seemed exotically Egyptian to foreigners, but accessible to any educated person. So we don't have evidence that people were walking around calling themselves Hermetists, like how Christian was a label of self-identity by this time, but it is likely there were voluntary associations of people reading these texts, holding to a Hermetic worldview of the cosmos and salvation, and participating in Hermetic rituals like that prayer of Thanksgiving. It's tricky though because these texts reflect the opinions of literate experts, literate philosophers speculating about the nature of the universe and God. So when you pick up Poimandres, are we getting a glimpse into a worldview and ritual life shared by a lot of people, or are we just getting a glimpse into the mind of a single literate philosopher? Overall, Hermetism offered what we could call a practical theology, an attempt to bridge abstract philosophical ideas with lived practical experience. Yes, Hermetism was rooted in complex theoretical cosmology and ideas about the nature of the divine, but it also offered concrete practices that initiated followers on a path towards salvation. For Hermetists, salvation is not something you just passively await. It's actively pursued through a process of alienation from the world, rebirth, and mystical union with the Supreme God. The belief that humans possess a dual nature, part material, part divine, implies an ethical responsibility to govern one's body and mind properly. Hermetic teachings thus encouraged followers to transcend earthly desires and the distractions of the material world in order to break free from fate's control. In this sense, Hermetism provides a pathway not only for understanding the cosmos, but for living a righteous, divinely attuned life. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Religion for Breakfast. I published my first video in October 2014, and back then one of my earliest inspirations was Abigail Thorne over at PhilosophyTube. She was starting to publish talking head explainer videos about philosophy. I was starting to publish explainer talking head videos about religious studies, but while my format has stayed mostly the same over the years, she has evolved into publishing these amazing 1-hour-long deep dives with elaborate costumes and sketches, and she's just recently jumped to the next level, releasing her first original short film, Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend. It's about two former rivals who share the same toxic ex, Count Dracula. Now, I know a lot of you watching my channel are into esoteric topics and the occult, so trust me, there's definitely some audience crossover appeal here. What better way to kick off spooky season than a film about vampires made by a philosophy content creator? You can watch it exclusively on Nebula, a streaming service built by and for independent creators where you can watch a ton of amazing content totally ad-free. And Abigail's film is a great example of what we're doing at Nebula, empowering independent creators to elevate their work, giving them the freedom and resources to make better stories with better production value, all without the negative incentives of clickbait and advertiser-friendly guidelines that you find on other platforms. You can find original content like Archaeology Quest, a show featuring two science creators trying to learn how to live in the Stone Age, making their own tools and hunting. We've also started a current events-based show called What to Follow USA, where the TLDR news team guides you through the weekly chaos of American political news. Nebula originals like these are the best example of what we do on Nebula. We're a group of dedicated creators coming together on our own platform to push ourselves to the next level. To get a yearly Nebula subscription for 40% off, head on over to go.nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. That works out to be $36 a year or only $3 a month. You can also get a lifetime membership for $300. Pay once, get Nebula access forever. That's a great choice if you don't want another subscription. Again, that's go.nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. Thanks everyone.